Audio lecture for World History, Unit 6, Part 1, Early Modern Europe with the Rise of Nation States, including Absolutism. First, we're going to start talking in general about the rise of nation states in early modern Europe. From new monarchs in the Renaissance era to absolute monarchs, and as well as some constitutional monarchies. We're going to first start by talking about Spain. In 1469, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile created a dynastic union of the peninsula's most powerful kingdoms. This is the Iberian Peninsula, and as you can see, Portugal is off to the left. Castile is in the middle, Aragon was off to the right. You combined Castile and Aragon to form Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were both extremely Catholic. Of course, at this point in time, in the 1400s, there was no other alternative in Europe. However, they had decided that they wanted to create the most Catholic nation. They both believed that Catholicism could serve as a unifying force on the Iberian Peninsula, and they could force out any remnants of the Muslims who had been in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula since the Umayyad dynasty spread there back in the 700s. They had a partnership with the Pope at the time. The Pope at the time was a Spanish Pope. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, and he became known as Pope Alexander VI. They had a partnership with him, and he even allowed them to appoint their own clergy without having to go through approval of the papacy for those clergy. Normally, the Pope and other members of the clergy in the church are the ones who appoint clergy. So this is something unusual. This is a special deal that the Spanish monarchs got because of their close relationship with the Spanish Pope at the time, Pope Alexander VI. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella completed what was known as the Reconquista, where they forced Muslims and Jews out of the kingdom. Now, of course, there would still be some remnants of Muslims and Jews left in the kingdom, and they would deal with them with the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition that would be started the same year. The person that they put in charge of this was St. James the Moorslayer. Wealth also generated from Spanish colonization of the Americas, and this greatly strengthened the Spanish monarchy. As we know, Ferdinand and Isabella were the ones that bankrolled Columbus's voyage across that landed in the New World. This made Spain emerge as leaders of the Catholic world in Europe, but even more than that, the most wealthy nation in the world at the time. Eventually, Charles V will actually come to control Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, and the American colonies that were controlled by Spain. Under Charles V, also known as Charles V as a nickname, he had been the Holy Roman Emperor, but the Habsburg family married into the family of Ferdinand and Isabella. And at one point, Charles V ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and all of its holdings, as well as Spain and all of its holdings. Eventually, he will give control over Spain to his son, Philip, who becomes Philip II, who eventually marries Mary I of England before her death. They will not be able to have any children, and then he will go to war with Elizabeth I of England. We'll talk more about her in a later slide. But Charles V, when he ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and its holdings and Spain and its holdings, he was the most powerful monarch in all of Europe. He is also the one who had to deal with the aftermath of the wars of religion in the Holy Roman Empire. He is the one who summoned Luther to the Diet at Worms in 1521, trying to force him to recant, which we know from the previous unit he did not, and that opened a whole can of worms in the Holy Roman Empire. So just so you know, this is a person we have talked about before, but of course now we're talking about him not just in his response to the Protestant Reformation, but also as one of these new monarchs, meaning the ones that are consolidating power around themselves and making sure that they have control over the economies and the religion and the armies in their realm. Here is the extent of Charles V's empire. As you can see, everything in yellow that is highlighted yellow ultimately was under his control for a good bit of time. As I said before, Charles V was a member of the Habsburg family, and sometimes you will see Habsburg spelled H-A-P-S-B-U-R-G instead of H-A-B-S-B-U-R-G. Both are fine. As I said, he was a member of this Habsburg family, and he hoped to centralize the possessions of the Habsburg family, controlling all of these territories that you see in green on this map. He was opposed, however, by Protestants because he fought against Luther's movement in the Holy Roman Empire. He was opposed by the French because the French Valois dynasty was in opposition to the Habsburg dynasty from really the beginning of the dynasties. They were surrounded by Habsburgs, if you see on all sides to the south in Spain, and to their east with the Holy Roman Empire. And so the Valois and the Habsburgs were often at war with each other. And that's another one of the reasons why, as I said in the last unit, that the French will eventually take part in the 30 Years' War against the Habsburgs, even though they were ultimately supporting the Protestant cause, even though France was a Catholic nation. The Habsburgs were also opposed by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, as you can see on the right, was putting pressure to the southern part of the Habsburg dynasty in the Holy Roman Empire. And they were trying to take territory. They will eventually reach all the way through Hungary and into Vienna. We mentioned this in an earlier unit. At the Battle of Vienna, finally the Ottomans will be turned back, but they still continue to put pressure on the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire under the Habsburgs. In 1556, Charles abdicated and split the empire between Austria, or the Holy Roman Empire, where the Habsburgs were originally from, and Spain. And this is when he gives Spain over to his son, Philip, who becomes Philip II. Charles's son, as I said, Philip II, will reign over Spain from 1556 to 1598, and he will rule Spain during the peak of Spanish power. Philip shared power with no other institutions. He believed in what was called the divine right of kings, believing that God gave him the power, therefore nobody should challenge him or question him. And he also believed in what would be known eventually as the absolute power of kings. Now, he is in the midst of this shift between what we call new monarchs, who were very powerful monarchs who were centralizing their authority, breaking the back of the feudal system, coming out of that in this early modern period, and then eventually the transition into true absolute monarchs. Philip is kind of in the middle there. He did believe in divine right of kings, which many absolute monarchs will. He did believe that his power should be absolute. However, he will be challenged by some and not quite reach absolute status like we will see in the next generation by the time we get into the 1600s in places like France under the Bourbon dynasty. Pope Pius V said of Philip II, "Your Majesty spends so long considering your undertakings that when the moment to perform them comes, the occasion has passed and the money has been spent." In other words, Pope Pius was basically saying he took too long to make decisions, and once he did make the decision, the time had passed. And ultimately, this would be Philip II's problem throughout his reign. Philip was, however, a devout Catholic, and he was fiercely opposed to heresy and to Protestantism. And like I said before, not only was Spain considered the most Catholic nation, Philip wanted to be considered the most Catholic king. Eventually, he will go to war against Elizabeth I of England. As I mentioned in a previous unit, he had been married to her older sister, Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary, if you will, but she had died within 5 years or so of her reigning, becoming Queen of England, and they never had a child. He was hoping that he would be able to control England and Spain through a male child that he would have with Mary. When she died, he tried to get Elizabeth to marry him when she became queen, his former sister-in-law. And she said, no. So ultimately, he will go to war with Elizabeth. He claims that she is a heretic as a Protestant. He claims that he has the right to try to take control over England because it should have been his anyways, he argued, since he had been married to the former queen. And ultimately, he will attack England several times, but it culminates in 1588 with this humongous fleet that he built specifically to attack Elizabeth. The Spanish Armada ultimately will fail. It was defeated, and Philip's planned invasion of England, hoping to reintroduce Catholicism to England, will also fail. It was said that he made an error since Pope Pius had criticized him of taking too long to make decisions to go and do things. He instead rushed this invasion. Many of these ships were not yet seaworthy when he set off the invasion. They will sink in the water before they ever get to England. Many others will actually be smashed upon the rocks. With a storm that brewed up as the battle ensued. The British ships will be smaller and more maneuverable in the smaller harbors, and they will be able to outmaneuver these large Spanish ships that did make it there. Ultimately, with the storm, with the smaller English ships, and with what the English will call with that storm the Protestant wind that they use to their advantage, they actually will take some captured Spanish ships, set them on fire, and then let the wind from the storm take them into the rest of the fleet, catching much of the fleet on fire. This was a huge victory for Queen Elizabeth I, but it was a huge defeat for Philip II of Spain. Spain's dominance in the 1500s, known as the Century of Gold, ultimately weakened in the 1600s. Laquier said, "To run the government was well beyond the powers of such a glutton for work and government as Philip. It overwhelmed his subnormal successors." Ultimately, his successors will be Philip III, who is said he was an, quote, undistinguished and insignificant man, a miserable monarch whose only virtue appeared to reside in a total absence of vice, a weak king. Another weak king, Philip IV, and then an even weaker king than that, Charles II. Charles II was short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. He was always on the verge of death, but repeatedly baffled Christendom by continuing to live. These are the successors of Philip II, And unfortunately for Spain, because of a series of weak rulers in that Habsburg dynasty, it will cause Spain to decline greatly throughout the 1600s. And instead, we will see the rise of France as the more dominant power in the 1600s. Now let's talk about the rise of absolute monarchy in France. France is not the only state to develop absolute monarchy, but they are the first, and they develop it, I guess you would say they create the blueprint that other monarchs want to follow, especially in terms of looking at Louis XIV. As we know, little background that we've talked about in previous units, between the 500s and the 1300s, French kings really had little power during that feudal era that was dominated by the nobility. This will start to shift a little bit after the 100 Years' War with England. Between 1337 and 1453, the 100 Years' War was fought against England to help centralize that royal power in France. Charles VII will be the victor. He will reign from 1422 to 1461, so he is the king during the final years of the 100 Years' War. He is responsible for defeating England and creating a permanent army for France. He also improved the finances with tax reforms. And the taille was a tax that was on land that he forced all French landowners to pay. It was basically a property tax that was issued. Charles VII will use these taxes to eventually help to stabilize the economy of France and to rebuild from the 100 Years' War. There was lots of devastation of the land due to that war, and a lot of rebuilding needed to be done. So he will use these funds to help him improve that. One of the big things that you need to know about absolute monarchs is they need to have control over the armies. They need to have control over the economy. They need to have control over religion in their country, and they need to have control over the nobility. Charles VII will be well on the way to creating that kind of government in this new dynasty, this Valois dynasty. Francis I, reigning from 1515 to 1547, agreed to what was known as the Concordat of Bologna with the church. This is another partnership like we saw in Spain with Ferdinand and Isabella with their pope. In 1515, when Francis I comes to the throne in France, he will sign an agreement, Concordat of Bologna, with the church that basically was an agreement with the Pope. The Pope allowed Francis I to choose his own clergy in the French Catholic Church. This is significant. This is another reason why France will remain a Catholic country and will never become a Protestant nation. The kings in France did not need to become Protestant to control and pick their own clergy like others kings might do in other nations, because they had this agreement, which is what Concordat means, with the church from the early years, 1515. Actually, I believe the Concordat itself was signed in 1516. By the time we get to 1624, a man who I've mentioned to you before, Cardinal Armand Richelieu, was appointed chief minister under King Louis XIII. Now we are in the Bourbon dynasty with the Louis. This is right after Louis XIII is the son of Henry IV, who had established the Bourbon dynasty after the French Wars of Religion that we discussed in a previous unit. He essentially ruled France until 1642. Cardinal Richelieu did. He was, of course, the chief minister of Louis XIII. But Louis XIII basically let Cardinal Richelieu run the show. Cardinal Richelieu had the stability of France always in mind. He wanted to make sure that France was growing in power and might. And the best way to do that was to limit the power of the Habsburg family to the south in Spain and to the east in the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, I discussed that challenge between the Valois kings and the Habsburg kings. Well, it continued with the Bourbon kings in France as well. So the best way to strengthen the power of France was to reduce the power of the Habsburg family. And that's why Cardinal Richelieu had France involved in the 30 Years' War against the Habsburg family. Richelieu said, "Government must be as firm a rock which crushes all that opposes it." Richelieu successfully and often ruthlessly increased the royal power with his actions, including what I said about the 30 Years' War. He helped to reduce the power of the nobility in France to give more power to the crown. He leveled their castles, and he even executed many of them as committing treason against the monarch for basically speaking out against his actions. He was doing all of this in the name of Louis XIII, the king. Richelieu said, "If you give me 6 lines written by the most honest man, I will find something in them to hang him." Richelieu created what was called the intendant system, which divided France into 32 provinces, each with its own appointed governor and standardized French language. These are important things that he did that helped to create more unity in France and also gave more power to the crown, to the king. These governors in these 32 provinces will act as the bureaucrats for the crown. They will answer to the crown, and they are responsible for making sure that all of the laws of the king are carried out in those provinces. They are also responsible for making sure the tax collection is done in a manageable way and the money gets back to the crown. In 1642, Cardinal Richelieu died, and Louis XIII died the very next year, leaving his 5-year-old son, Louis XIV, now king. So Louis XIV will be Europe's longest reigning monarch. He surpassed Elizabeth II, who just passed away recently by only 2 years, though. But he became king when he was 5, as opposed to being in his 20s like Elizabeth was. Let's talk a little bit about Louis XIV, because under Louis XIV, we will see absolute monarchy perfected. Louis XIV was mentored by Bishop Bossuet. Bishop Bossuet was a political theorist that supported the idea of absolute power in the hands of a king. He also supported the idea of the divine right of kings, believing that God appointed this ruler to have this absolute power. This is why the monarch should never be challenged. Bossuet said, "The royal power is absolute. Without this absolute authority of the king could neither do nor repress evil. It is necessary that his power be such that no one can escape him." Louis XIV became the most powerful king in French history. Many would argue in European history. He called himself the Sun King. You can see him here with a costume where he called himself the Sun King. It was designed to look like the sun, and he called himself the Sun King because he saw himself as the center of the French universe, just as the sun was the center of the universe. Now, it's important to know that by the time Louis XIV was crowned king, the scientific revolution had begun, and the notion of a heliocentric universe, meaning a sun-centered universe, was accepted. And so him referring to himself in this way actually tracks. He also boasted oftentimes, "L'état c'est moi," which means I am the state. He basically is arguing to people that he is where the power of France comes from, not from the people. He is the state of France. The people who live in France are merely his subjects. Here is a quote from Louis XIV. "Consider the king in his work chamber. From it goes forth the orders that make magistrates and captains, citizens and soldiers, provinces, navies, and armies act together. He is the image of God, who from his throne in highest heaven makes all the world go." So that's very, very boastful. He claimed himself to be the divine right king, so no one was above him other than God. Louis was very good at making the nobility weaker. That was a big deal for an absolute monarch, to make sure that they weakened the nobility, because the nobility, if you remember, in the Middle Ages had a lot of power since they controlled the military back then. So one way to make sure that you can gain control over your own military is to not be dependent upon the nobles for the military. Well, Louis went beyond that. He made sure that the nobles of France ultimately kowtowed to him, and they ultimately they became emasculated under him. Louis forced the nobles first and foremost to live in a brand new palace that Louis had built about 12 miles outside of the capital city of Paris. This new palace was called Versailles, as you see there. Versailles Palace was a grand palace, and yes, he's inviting them to come and live with him at the palace. However, they cannot do everything that they want there. He is keeping his watchful eye on them. So he moves them there, and they have to spend a certain number of months there a year, not being on their own estates, so they cannot rebel against him. He could keep watch over them. He could control them, and life at Versailles was heavily regulated. He even forced them to participate in parties and games where he forced them to pay for the privilege of coming to these parties and these games. They had to spend all of their money on costumes and clothing, and he forced them to gamble all their money away in games that were played on a daily basis at Versailles. They had competitions to see who would gain the attention of the king, who would have the honor to help dress the king in the morning. These are all things that normally servants would do, and he had all of them groveling at his feet. Ultimately, Louis was able to have not just them under his thumb, but the nobles were actually under his heel. Financially, he was able to get a good person in charge of the finances. His name was Colbert. Colbert did his best to try to bring as much wealth into France as possible under the mercantilist system and minimize the amount of wealth going out. Unfortunately, Louis XIV was spending money faster than Colbert could bring it in. Financial and economic mismanagement will plague Louis's reign throughout his reign. Tax revenues ultimately ended up not being able to cover the expenditures, meaning the spending of Louis XIV, not just on life at Versailles, but also on the many wars that he fought. Louis was able to stave off disaster during his reign, but his successors will inherit this financial debt ultimately, and they will pay the price for it, especially a couple of generations after Louis XIV. When Louis XVI is on the throne, that is when the French Revolution happens. We'll talk about that in a later unit. Louis did exempt nobles from paying certain taxes, putting the bigger burden on the third estate, the middle and lower classes. However, he did force them to pay for the privilege of living at Versailles, where he forced them to live in the first place. So do not think that they actually had a privilege by being exempt from these taxes. They were exempt from certain taxes, but they had to spend all their money on other things. This way, Louis was in complete control. The lower classes bore the brunt of the tax burden, and ultimately this will, burden them a great deal, and like I say, later generations will suffer as a result of this. Louis named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he was the one that I mentioned before, to control his finances, the controller general rather of the finances, and he adopted strict mercantilist policies to try to improve the French economy, since Louis had so much that he needed to spend on. Now, as I said before, absolute monarchs can only be absolute if they have control over four things. They have to control the nobility. Louis did that. They have to control the armies. Louis will do that. We'll discuss more about that later. They have to control the economy, which he did with the help of Colbert. But they also had to control the church. Louis XIV in 1685 will revoke the earlier rule that Henry IV had put in place. The Edict of Nantes, which ultimately allowed for French Huguenots to worship in private and no longer be persecuted for being Protestants. Remember, Henry IV had been a Protestant before he became king. He converted to Catholicism when he became king as the first Bourbon king. He said Paris is worth a mass. And he ultimately passes, however, the Edict of Nantes in 1598 to basically end the wars of religion in France, but also to make it so the Huguenots would no longer be persecuted. They just had to worship in private and continue to pay the tithes to the Catholic Church. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked that Edict of Nantes with his own edict called the Edict of Fontainebleau. This basically was him saying he no longer needed to tolerate Protestants in his nation. His goal was one king, one law, one faith. And so he no longer felt the need to tolerate the French Huguenots. Many of them continued to worship in secret. If they were caught, they would be executed as committing treason against the king. Many of them also will, besides being executed, many of them will decide, it's time to just leave France. Many of them will come to the New World and settle in parts of New France as a result of this. Louis XIV hoped to extend France in Europe. This is the military part of the absolute monarchy, okay? He hoped to extend France in Europe and conquer Spanish possessions in the New World, creating a universal monarchy under Louis XIV. He will propose a series of wars. We call them the Wars of Louis XIV. And if you look at this map, you will see the territories that he conquered during his reign. Now, this does not look like a huge amount of territory, but they were key territories that he was able to take control over that will bring wealth to France and also will bring a lot of power to France ultimately. Between 1701 and 1713, a big war, the final war of Louis XIV, will be fought, called the War of Spanish Succession. During this war, the rest of the European big power nations will actually join to fight against Louis XIV. They call themselves the Grand Alliance of Nations, and they fought to prevent the unification of France and Spain under the War of Spanish Succession. What ultimately happened here was this. Charles II was the last king of the Habsburg line in Spain. He was the brother, however, of Louis XIV's wife. When Charles dies without an heir in Spain, Louis XIV and his wife determined that they have a claim to the throne. Louis XIV wants to place his grandson on the throne in Spain because, of course, his son is being groomed to be the next king of France. This caused many of the nations of Europe, like Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, these territories all to say, no, that will mean that too much power will be in the hands of France, of Louis XIV. And remember what I said before. After the end of the 30 Years' War, no longer would wars be fought over religion. From that point on, the wars that, what determines why a nation goes to war normally has to do with balance of power. The balance of power would be too much in the favor of France and of Louis if they allowed him to take over Spain. So that is what this war was about, 1701 to 1713, the War of Spanish Succession. It was a very costly war, and Louis's financial mismanagement ultimately left France weakened. The financial and social tensions will escalate for his successors. Ultimately, Louis's grandson will be able to take the throne in Spain, so there will be a Bourbon on the throne in Spain that also has Habsburg blood through his mother. But there was a compromise that had to be made with the rest of those European nations for him to be able to take this throne. And that was that the nations of Spain and France had to always be ruled separately. They could not be ruled as one joint large empire. Now let's talk a little bit about England, because in England we ultimately have what's known as a limited monarchy. And this is not that English monarchs did not want to rule absolutely, but because of the tradition, the precedent had been set back in 1215 with the signing of the Magna Carta by King John I, that set the precedent that there would always be Parliament, basically, that had certain prerogatives when it came to governing, especially when it came to raising taxes. And so Parliament would always be something that the monarchs in England, not just kings, of course, queens as well, monarchs in England would have to negotiate and deal with. There will be a series of kings that will try to rule absolutely, and some of them actually become embroiled in conflict with Parliament, resulting in some tragedies like the English Civil War, which we'll discuss in this section. But ultimately, what we're going to see happen is in England, there will be this drift away from a style of absolute monarchy, and instead a drift towards what we call constitutional government or constitutional monarchy. And in a word, why does this happen? It happens because of Parliament. England had a history of limited monarchy. As I said before, the Magna Carta had established that back in 1215. Common law and Parliament would, the king was not above the law. He was held to the same laws that the regular people were. Parliament has certain prerogatives, especially when it came to taxation. And so England will resist the trend in Europe towards absolutism. Again, not that some kings in England didn't try to become absolute monarchs. They just were not able to do so completely, largely because of this precedent that had been set early on for a limited monarchy. The English constitutionalism ultimately was challenged by powerful new monarchs. Between 1500 and 1700, there will be new monarchs that will start the drift looking like they are going to push towards having absolute monarchy in England. But as we know, they will not be able to quite get there like Louis XIV had done in France. One of these new monarchs, of course, was Henry VIII that we discussed in a previous unit. Henry VIII reigned from 1509 to 1547, and as we know, he severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church in a massive power grab. It was a completely political thing, not just to get his heir, but also to grab some more power. He gained control over lands in England. He gained the money from those lands. So, you know, when you think about absolute monarchs having to have control over the economy, the military, the church, and the nobles, you can see that Henry VIII was trying to do that with a lot of the moves that he made and that we discussed in previous units. We know that his daughter, Elizabeth I, yes, there were others before her. There was, of course, her brother, Edward VI, and then her sister, Mary I. But Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, became very popular and powerful. She was probably the closest to an absolute monarch that England had. But she was not really an absolute monarch. She just learned how to work with the parliament to get what she wanted, if you will. She was known as the Virgin Queen because she refused to marry after what had happened with her sister, and the idea that perhaps, you know, Spain might eventually be able to control England, because if they had had a child that would rule over both England and Spain. Remember, she had been married to the King of Spain, Philip II. Elizabeth decided that she was not going to do that. Okay, she was not going to allow England to be subject to any other nation or anything like that. So she refused to marry. So that meant that she died with no heir, and that ended the Tudor dynasty. Even though she ruled for a long time and she was able to create a very stable and strong government for England, eventually a new dynasty will have to be established. After she dies with no heir, it will go to the Stuart family, who are her cousins, who are the rulers in Scotland. So this is where you start seeing what we call now Great Britain, where you have England and Scotland become part of a greater Britain. King James I will be the first of the Stuart monarchs in England, establishing the new dynasty, cousin of Elizabeth I. He will reign England from 1603 to 1625. And the Stuart dynasty, starting with him, tried to assert over England the notion of the divine right of kings. Now, believing that, remember, divine right of kings basically means that they believe that God placed them in this position of power, and therefore they cannot be challenged. Challenging the king means challenging God. And ultimately, the Stuarts, starting with James I, tried to rule with divine right, wanting a monarchy free from parliamentary restraints. Well, this is not going to go over well with the English Parliament or with the English people. And so ultimately, we will see a lot of turmoil during the Stuart monarchs' reigns. The Stuarts clash with the House of Commons, which is the lower house of parliament. It is not really elected by common people, though. Don't be fooled by its name. There will be two houses of parliament, as we said in a previous unit, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But the House of Commons at this point in time is only elected by the wealthy people. So that really means the nobility in England control both houses of parliament. However, the Stuarts will clash with the House of Commons over power, and the Puritans. Remember those Puritans that we mentioned in a previous unit? They were English Calvinists that wanted to reorganize the Anglican Church. They felt that it had not been really purified enough during the Protestant Reformation of Henry VIII, and they wanted more reforms to be made. So he clashes with the Puritans. They want him to make more reforms. The House of Commons basically does not want him to think that he could rule, meaning James I and the others too, as absolute monarchs. And so there are clashes. And this continues with his son, Charles I. Charles I when he becomes king in 1625, he will reign until 1649, he decided that he would try to raise taxes without Parliament's consent, which we know from back in the Magna Carta was something that was not allowed in the British government. But he tried to do this by raising ship taxes. Ultimately, what ends up happening when he does this is that he basically disbanded Parliament. He basically bullied Parliament, disbanded them. He put people in jail for opposing him, trying to act like an absolute divine right king. He put them in jail without a trial, violating the habeas corpus rights, which had been put in place years before in England. Again, as a basis of what had started with the Magna Carta. And he basically was trying to act like an absolute monarch, and Parliament was not having it. This ultimately ends in I guess you would say, a summit meeting in 1628, where Charles I was forced by Parliament to agree to sign what was called the Petition of Right, denying him the right to tax or imprison people without due process. This was an attempt of Parliament to stave off, ultimately, rebellion against Charles I. Charles I at the time was not quite ready to face that kind of rebellion, so he agreed to the Petition of Right, but he never intended on really adhering to it. And this is why the English Civil War will eventually happen. So what's in the Petition of Right? Charles cannot raise taxes. He has to make sure that there are speedy trials for those that are imprisoned. And he can't imprison people without just cause. He also can't quarter or house troops in people's houses during peacetime. These should all sound familiar to you all as students living in America, because these are all things that will eventually be incorporated into our own Constitution. Between 1629 and 1640, okay, this shows you, this is a year later after the Petition of Right is signed, Charles I broke the Petition of Right, and he basically disbanded Parliament and tried to rule without Parliament for that 11-year period. Okay, he called this the personal rule, and he ultimately tried to rule without Parliament. He forced loans on nobles. He basically would send in his own personal henchmen to shake down people and make them, basically robbing them of their money, and to keep the government going and keep his wars that he had going on with others going as well. He was a bully, and he also reinforced some Catholic traditions in the Anglican Church. Even though he was Protestant officially, he had a soft spot for Catholics. He had a Catholic wife, and he had a soft spot for Catholics, and ultimately some of the Catholic traditions had been reinstated in the Anglican Church, which did nothing but tick off those Puritans who were already thinking that the church was not purified enough. In 1640, after 11 years of ruling without Parliament and basically shaking people down and bullying them into paying for his wars by himself, he is forced to call the Parliament to come back into session because he is broke and he needs more money than he can get from forcing loans. So the House of Commons took the opportunity to try to get Charles I to agree to some certain reforms. The House of Commons abolished the House of Lords. Now, really, the House of Lords still exists. It's just no longer really a power player in the Parliament. Okay, and they sought to end the king's power over the Anglican Church. These were things that the Parliament wanted, and they felt like they had Charles I right where they wanted him, because he was coming to them basically hat in hand, saying that he needed their help to get the funds that he needed for his wars. So starting in 1642, the English Civil War commenced. Basically, what we see with the English Civil War is the King, Charles I, and his supporters versus Parliament, or the House of Commons, which is really the only part of Parliament that has power at this point, and their supporters. So the English Civil War ultimately saw the Cavaliers, those were the supporters of the King, fight against the Roundheads, those were the supporters of Parliament, and the Puritans. The ones that were fighting for Parliament were basically fighting for a government that was not under an absolute monarch, because it was obvious after Charles I abolished the Petition of Right after signing it the year before and ruling without Parliament for 11 years that he was not going to work nicely with Parliament, and he intended on shifting the British government to an absolute monarchy. So, war will ensue, and it goes on for 9 years. The English Civil War would ultimately determine who had the real power in England. Would it be the king, or would it be Parliament? In 1649, the Roundheads, which were the parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell, who was a member of the House of Commons, who was a strict, staunch Puritan, they captured and put on trial for treason and then executed King Charles I. King Charles I ultimately loses the English Civil War, the parliamentary forces win, and they execute the king, having found him guilty for committing treason against the people of England. This is the first time we have ever seen in world history the monarch being executed by his own people. And needless to say, this made other monarchs throughout the rest of Europe sit up and take notice of what was going on in England, making many of them very nervous. Charles I, as I said, was the first European monarch tried and executed by his own people. This was proof that England will not tolerate absolutism and that there would have to be some other form of government moving forward. England was at a turning point moment in its history. The triumph of popular justice over royal majesty is what this was called. Now, Cromwell and the House of Commons of Parliament then now take control over what they will call the Commonwealth of England, and they abolish the monarchy. Instead, they will rule the nation as a commonwealth ruled by Parliament, but Parliament is under the control of Oliver Cromwell, who is a strict Puritan, as I said before. Cromwell, who is now called the Lord Protector, created basically what is really a puritanical dictatorship in England. He launched a strict moral code that he insisted all Englishmen follow. He censored the press of any ridicule of his policies. He prohibited sports because he thought that they led people astray and led them to the devil. He closed the theaters and the opera houses. All of the cultural practices that had been going on in England that they were known for so long, all of the, Shakespearean plays, etc., all of the cultural stuff he got rid of. And so oftentimes historians refer to him as No Fun Cromwell, because he was such a staunch Puritan that he got rid of all of the cultural practices in England, thinking they would lead people to the devil and away from God. Needless to say, Cromwell and his actions will prove not very popular among a lot of English citizens. So once Cromwell dies, since he was not a king, he was just Lord Protector, then the people of England in the House of Commons, since they are what is basically in charge of the government now, had to determine what to do next. Well, for a little while, Cromwell's son tried to take over where his father left off. But since his father was not a king, and there were a lot of people in England, including other members of the House of Commons, that were not pleased with the way things had gone under Cromwell's dictatorship, they decided to go a different way. So in 1660, the eldest son of the king that was killed, okay, so Charles I was the one that was executed. His eldest son, named Charles also, who had been living in exile in France during the English Civil War, seeing what had happened to his dad, he wasn't stupid, okay, that Charles ends up being invited by Parliament to come back and rule over England. They decided that they liked things better under a monarch than they did under the Lord Protector dictatorship. But because they were inviting him back to restore the Stuart dynasty, and he will reign from 1660 to 1685, returning from exile, ending that interregnum period, which is between the kings. Okay, the people in the House of Commons said that there were certain parameters with which Charles had to agree to. He had to agree to rule with Parliament and not against Parliament in many different ways. Charles II was always very merry and was therefore not so much a king as a monarch. During the Civil War, he had rendered valuable assistance to his father's side by hiding in all the oak trees he could find. He was thus very romantic and popular and was able, after the death of Cromwell, to descend to the throne. Ultimately, Charles II is known as the Merry Monarch for a number of reasons. One of the big things he does is he restores the cultural practices to England. The theaters open again, the sports return, all of those things. He also is referred to as the Merry Monarch because he had a lot of illegitimate children. He ended up having no legitimate heirs. His wife was barren, but he had many illegitimate children. Some historians say upwards of 19, and so therefore that could be another reason he's known as the Merry Monarch. Ultimately, because Charles II, he did restore the Stuart monarchy, it's sometimes known as the Restoration. He will kind of mind his P's and Q's and do what he's supposed to under the watchful eye of Parliament. But because he dies without an heir, a legitimate heir, the throne will then pass to his younger brother, who had also been living in exile during the time where the Civil War took place in the interregnum. In 1685, the younger brother, James, becomes James II. He inherits the throne, excuse me, and he hoped to return England to Catholicism. He had actually been living in France. He had been married to a wife before that had passed away, and he had been raised Protestant, and he had raised two daughters with this first wife and as a Protestant. But since he had been living in exile and the first wife died, by the way, his two daughters were grown by this point. He married a Catholic woman, and he had decided to become Catholic himself. This is where we run into a real problem because there had been legislation passed by Parliament in the past that said, this is after Mary I tried to make England Catholic again. They had forced legislation that basically said no monarch in in England can be Catholic. They have to be Protestant. Not only that, but they were concerned now because not only was he Catholic, but he and his wife were planning on having children, and he was hoping to raise these new children, not the first two that were already grown that were raised from his previous wife that were raised Protestant. But he was planning on raising any future children as Catholics. And what would happen if he had a boy? Well, that boy would inherit the throne, and he would be a Catholic inheriting the throne in England, which again was against laws that had been passed in England in previous decades. So what ends up happening when, within 3 years of him ascending the throne, James II is overthrown by the Parliament ultimately in what is known as the bloodless, glorious revolution. Ultimately, the people of England would not accept a Catholic king. When he did have a son in 1688 that he intended to raise Catholic, they knew that that would be the next heir to the throne, and they would not tolerate having a Catholic on the throne and trying to return England to Catholicism. So ultimately, what they did is Parliament justified this by inviting the eldest daughter of James II, who, as I said before, was one of his children with his first wife, who had been raised Protestant. Her name was Mary, and she had been married to a noble in the Dutch Republic. William of Orange was his name. So Parliament, the House of Commons, invited William and Mary to basically come and replace her father on the throne. This way, Parliament justified keeping the Stuart line on the throne, so they weren't really, getting rid of the kingship completely, but they also were requiring William and Mary to make some compromises with Parliament. Meanwhile, King James II, having seen what had happened to his father, Charles I, he fled. He fled to France. He said, nope, I'm not going to fight against this. And that is why it's called the Glorious Revolution. It is a bloodless revolution. Ultimately, this leads to a new era and the beginning of constitutional monarchy in England. Okay, 1689, Parliament, as we said, made this new king and queen, William of Orange and Mary, who is now Mary II, accept that they would rule jointly with Parliament, and they would also agree that their power would be limited by certain parameters that they would put in the English Bill of Rights. Again, this is the beginning of a constitutional monarchy in England, which they still have to this day in England. What is of note of this is this ultimately reinforces the Magna Carta, but even goes farther. It basically says that there are certain limits to the monarch's power, and there are certain powers that are reserved for, quote, the people, which really is the Parliament, which at this point in time, the House of Commons is elected only by the wealthiest of individuals in England. That will change over the centuries, but at this point, it's still controlled by the wealthy people. But this is a big deal. This is the first constitutional government in England. It is a larger constitutional government than they had in the Dutch Republic. And of course, this also, you need to look at this as a difference. If you're doing comparison between what's going on in England and what's going on in other countries at this same time, at the end of the 17th century, you need to make note that while most of Europe is, under absolute monarchs, England is abandoning the idea of absolutism and instead reinforcing constitutional government. Yes, they still have a monarch, but they do have certain limits to the monarch's power, and the limits to the power of the monarch are limited by the power of the people as represented in Parliament. This is a big deal. England became, as I said, a constitutional monarchy, which basically really at this point was still controlled by an aristocratic oligarchy. The House of Commons and the House of Lords, even though the House of Lords does not really have any real powers at this point, but it's still in the hands of the wealthy. The only people who are allowed to elect members to the House of Commons are the wealthy. But this is a rejection of the idea of divine right, absolute monarchy, which is significant considering the rest of Europe is undergoing a transformation towards absolutism, while England is pulling away from it. Comparison, historical thinking skill. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the Netherlands or in the Dutch Republic, or how it becomes the Dutch Republic and then, of course, moving forward. The Dutch were not governed by absolutism. The political power was in the hands instead of wealthy merchants, with each of the 7 provinces really being politically independent. This is where William of Orange, who had married Mary Stuart, the 2 of them invited into England in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution, came from. He came from the Dutch Republic. He was one of the heads of the government there. The lack of absolutism in the Dutch Republic, combined with religious freedom that they had, made the Netherlands very unique in Europe. The Dutch had a pro-business economic had pro-business economic policies in place. For example, they promoted the idea of banks loaning money to businesses so those businesses could expand their businesses. They were very much interested in fostering more commercial enterprises throughout the Republic. Shipping was a big industry because of their location on the coast. And they had little government interference in business at all. So this was not a mercantilist kind of economy like we had seen in most of the other nations of Europe that were under absolute monarchs. Instead, they let the businessmen determine what was the best thing to happen in the economy of the Dutch Republic. This is free enterprise. In the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was the leading commercial power in Europe. Amsterdam, the capital city, was Europe's financial center. The Bank of Amsterdam ultimately replaced the powerful Italian banks that had been in the hands of the Medici family for so many generations. And now the Dutch led the world in banking. The Dutch East India Company that we've discussed in a previous unit also was powerful because they were able to displace the Portuguese and gain control over the lucrative spice trade in East Asia. Costly wars, however, with England and France weakened the Dutch Republic by the time we get to 1700. And those wars were basically over control over colonial territories in the New World. We talked about some of that in a previous unit, and ultimately the Dutch Republic becomes weaker as England and France become more powerful by the time we enter the 18th century, 1700. What about Russia? Let's now talk about the absolutist Russian Empire. Now, as discussed in a previous unit, in the 1200s, the Mongols had conquered Russia and cut them off from the rest of Europe. We discussed how Russia was basically isolated from the rest of Europe, and we called it the Mongol yoke. They were under the Mongol yoke. Remember, Russia was part of what had been referred to as the Golden Horde, that part of the Mongol Empire. And so because they were cut off from the rest of Europe during the High Middle Ages under the Mongol yoke, that will ultimately make Russia be a little bit behind the rest of Europe when it comes to modernization. Like I said, we mentioned this in an earlier unit, so I'm making that connection back here. Russia was also geographically isolated as well. The Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, which we're going to be discussing in a future unit, that was all going on at the same time. All of these things going on in the 1500s and 1600s didn't really affect Russia because of this geographic isolation. Russian nobles, known as boyars, often resisted the centralization of power under a strong absolute monarch. They often served the Mongols then, while the Mongols were in control over Russia, for their own benefit, making deals with the Mongol rulers. And ultimately, it was hard for Russia to centralize under a strong king, centralized king, absolutist king, for quite a while. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, was probably the first to attempt to move in this direction of centralization of Russia under one king. Ivan the Great ruled from 1462 to 1505, managed to get out from under the Mongol yoke. One of the things that he did was he controlled the Orthodox Church and made sure that the Orthodox Church would not be able to undercut his authority, which, remember, is one of the things that an absolute monarch has to have control over, the church. And he began driving the Mongols from Russia, gaining, I guess you would say, control over all of those lands, pushing the Mongols out. Then comes Ivan IV. Now, Ivan IV is not as well. He's as strong a king as Ivan III, but he's not as good is the only word I can think of as Ivan III had been. Ivan IV is also known as Ivan the Terrible. He ruled from 1547 to 1584, and he was a cruel king. He forced the Mongols out finally, once and for all. The previous Ivan had started the process. Ivan the Terrible ends the process. But he also aggressively terrorized the Russian nobles, those boyars. Ivan III and Ivan IV, however, will use their new centralized power to start funding construction of a new capital for their kingdom at the Kremlin. It's a huge complex of palaces, government buildings, monuments, and churches right in the center of Moscow. Today, the Kremlin still stands. It's still seen as the center of government in Moscow, Russia today. Ivan IV used the Cossacks. The Cossacks are militaristic nomadic peasants. They had learned a lot from the Mongols, a lot of their tactics from the Mongols, being under the Mongol yoke for so long. And he used these militaristic nomadic peasants to help him expand his control into deeper Central Asia. This is one of the reasons why we say that Russia is part of Eurasia, because part of it's in Europe and part of it is in Asia. It's a massive amount of territory. In 1584, after the death of Ivan the Terrible, and by the way, he had killed his own son because he was angry, thinking that his son was trying to replace him, and Ivan was, well, he was crazy. So anyhow, you can read more about that in your packet and in your textbook readings. But after the death of Ivan the Terrible, Russia went through a period known as the Time of Troubles. It was a chaotic period. They had come out from under this strong but brutal king, and the reaction was kind of, crazy and chaotic. And it's going to, all of that centralization that had begun under Ivan III and Ivan IV kind of starts to unravel a bit. It will not be until 1613 that chaos comes to an end. The boyars, who again, remember, are the Russian nobles, they sought to restore order, ending the peasant rebellions, ending the Cossack rebellions, etc. And they chose for their leader a new man named Michael Romanov. Michael Romanov will become the new Tsar. Now, Ivan III had taken that title, which basically meant king or ruler. Remember, we talked about this title before. Sometimes you see it spelled Tsar, sometimes you see it spelled Czar, and it basically means king. It's really taken from Caesar, though, from the word Caesar. Anyhow, Michael Romanov will establish a new dynasty called the Romanov dynasty in 1613. And members of the Romanov family will be in charge in Russia, will have control over the throne, will have the czarship, if you will, until 1917, when the Russian Revolution happens in the midst of World War I. That is a very long dynasty, over 300 years. Probably the most powerful of all of the Romanov rulers was Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725. He recognized that Russia was behind the rest of Europe. He had done a lot of traveling early in his life, traveled all over Europe, visited the court of Louis XIV, went all over and studied how these kingdoms that had become centralized and had absolute rulers, how they governed themselves. And he wanted to rule Russia in the same way. So he comes back to Russia with all of these Western style ideas, and he wants to rule Russia like an absolute monarch, like Louis XIV ruled in France. Here's a quote about Peter. It said, Peter had the mind of a genius, the body of a giant, and the temper of a bear. The mind of a genius, he was quite the intellectual, and he wanted to reinforce that in Russia. Thought that was part of the reason Russia was behind. The body of a giant, the man was about 7 feet tall, folks. He actually, when he went on his journeys throughout Europe, he tried to do so incognito, which basically means in disguise. But that was really difficult to do because he was so much taller than everybody else. He's about 7 feet tall when most men at this point in time did not get taller than maybe 5'5". So it was kind of hard to hide. The temper of a bear, he was known to be brutal, maybe not as brutal as Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, but brutal nonetheless. He was willing to use cruelty in order to get the things that he wanted done. Besides just visiting the royal court of France, of course, Peter also visited England and Holland, hoping to learn about military, technology, and Western customs. We also see he visits Vienna as well. This big tour across Europe was known as Peter the Great's Grand Embassy. And you see him here in disguise. Well, he was dressed more like a noble than a king. But again, it's about 7 feet tall. It's kind of hard to hide. Peter returned to Russia, vowing Westernization would be brought to Russia, and he hoped to transform Russia into a great power by forcing it to Westernize. In other words, forcing Russia to become more like Western Europe in order for it to be able to compete with Western Europe. Peter focused on modernizing the Army and the Navy first. He brought in new technologies that he learned about on his Grand Embassy, and he also imported in Western advisors from other parts of Europe to help advise him on how to do this. Now remember, folks, an absolute monarch has to have control over 4 things, like I've mentioned before. He has to have control over the army. This is a big part of it. The military, I should say, Army and Navy. This is part of that. He has to have control over the economy. He has to have control over the church, and he has to have control over the nobility. We will see how Peter does all of these things. Peter liberated Russian women also, oddly enough, allowing them to appear in public without veils and ending arranged marriages. This was something that had been in place since the Mongols had ruled over Russia. It actually had been kept in place under the reigns of the Ivans, and this is something that he removed. But this is one way that Russia will become a little bit more westernized. I'm not saying that women had equal rights, don't get me wrong, but he did liberate them more than they had been prior to him being in power. Now, the control over the nobility, this is what Peter did. Peter, the boyars, remember, are the Russian nobility. Peter wanted to westernize Russia, and by doing that, he also wanted to change the way people thought about everything. Russian customs were firmly entrenched. Okay, and part of those Russian customs were the big long beards and the big long robes that the Russian boyars wore. So what Peter did was he forced the boyars to shave off their traditional beards and adopt Western style clothing and Western style other styles of things. Kind of like Louis XIV had forced the nobles to live with him at Versailles and do his bidding. This was a way for Peter to show the boyars that he was in charge. If he could force them to shave their beards and change the way they dress, and they had no choice, if they didn't follow along, they could be executed as committing treason against the king. He was showing them that he was the one that had the real power. The nobles did not have the real power. The most inventive taxer in history, he also taxed windows, cellars, bridges, baths, shoes, hats, melons, and of course beards. If a noble did decide that he wanted to keep his beard, Peter basically would let him do so if he paid a huge beard tax. And this beard tax was so high that no noble really could afford, even a noble couldn't afford to pay this. So this is one of the things why they call him the most inventive taxer in history. He taxed all of these things, any window in your house, any cellar, all of these things, in order to get money for his projects, his major building projects, the building up of his army and his navy, etc. Speaking of building projects, in 1703, after having defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War and gaining territory closer to Western Europe, Peter began building a new city for himself, a new capital city to replace Moscow as the capital. Peter began building what he will refer to as St. Petersburg, named the city, of course, after himself. And it is a city on the Baltic Sea, and he saw it as a great window for Russia to look out at Europe, the window on the West, or the window to the West, as it's sometimes called. It was a Western-style capital for a Western-style absolutist ruler, and of course, this major building project cost the lives of many people. His demands were high. The quotas were high. It is said that thousands and thousands of people died in the process of building St. Petersburg. And like Louis XIV, he will force the nobles to move to St. Petersburg as well, so he can keep his watchful eye on them. St. Petersburg, as I said, was a Western-style city that symbolized the more powerful and more modern Russia under Peter the Great. Peter sought to control those warriors, like I said, and he forced them to build their own houses in St. Petersburg. Now, he didn't force them to live in his palace. Peterhof was the name of his palace. He built it very similar to the style of Versailles, which was the palace that Louis XIV had built. But he did force them to live in the city. So ultimately, they were not allowed to remain on their own estates. They had to live basically under his watchful eye at all times, showing them who really had the power. The boyars also had to serve in the army or in the bureaucracy under Peter. Now, this is where we see a little bit of a difference between Peter and Louis XIV. Louis XIV would not let the nobles hold positions in the bureaucracy because he didn't trust them. Instead, he basically brought middle-class folks up to the position of nobility by giving them those jobs. People like Colbert that he had put in charge of the finances. But in Russia, it was a little different. In Russia, he basically forced the nobles to cooperate with him. He did give them positions in the bureaucracy, known as the table of ranks. It disregarded noble titles and rewarded boyars who served the Tsar as long as they remained loyal. So he does control the nobles like Louis XIV does, but he does allow them to still have positions in the bureaucracy rather than replacing them with the middle class like Louis XIV did. Louis XIV in France had a middle class that he could depend upon to fill those positions, whereas there was no real middle class in Russia. So Peter did not have the ability to give those positions to someone else below the nobles, because really there were only nobles and peasants. So this is the way he dealt with that. He gave them positions of power. He kept a close, watchful eye on them with the table of ranks. Russia's serfs were still heavily exploited. Their lives did not get any better under Peter the Great. They were conscripted into the army, meaning that they were drafted into the army. They were forced to build St. Petersburg. As I said before, thousands of them will die in the process. And they could even be bought and sold as pieces of property that belonged to the estates of those boyar nobles. Peter the Great was mostly hated. The Orthodox Church in Russia opposed his reforms. They saw them as dangerous and too Western, and they were taking Russia in the wrong direction, the Russian clergy and the Orthodox Church would say. The nobles, many of them, hated the cultural reforms. They hated having to shave their beards. They hated having to wear the Western style clothing, and they eventually started to resent Peter for what he was doing to Russia. And the serfs, as I said, were worse off. Peter the Great staved off rebellion during his reign, but his successors are going to have to deal with some of these issues between the Russian nobles and the Russian peasants toward this absolute style rule in Russia. Peter's son Alexei was even arrested for plotting to overthrow his own father. That son Alexei would eventually die in prison. By 1750, Russia had a limited maritime presence, naval presence, but it still did benefit from some of the things that Peter had done. It ranked among the world's great and largest land-based empires due to some of the advances that Peter the Great brought in. Even though the Russians did not like the westernization as a whole, if you look at historically what he did for the Russian Empire, it can be seen as bringing benefits in the long run. However, it was not something that was appreciated by the Russians at the time, and his successors will have to face some opposition as a result of that. We'll discuss that in later units.